The cigarette was still burning when he set it on the edge of the ashtray. He did not crush it out. He did not finish it. He set it down the way you set something down when you have decided that whatever comes next does not require it. With the specific deliberateness of a man whose hands have already moved onto a decision that the rest of the room has not yet understood. Or understood. The backstage corridor of the Greek theater in Los Angeles smelled like concrete and cold air, and the particular kind of tension that exists before a show when everything is ready, and the only variable is the man who has to variable if 4 minutes to walk out. Dean Martin stood in that corridor in the summer of 1988. He was 71 years old. He had a glass in his hand. He had been holding it the way he always held a glass, loose, familiar, the gesture of a man so accustomed to the prop that it had become part of his body. But something in him that night was not holding anything loose. He looked at the door that led to the stage. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he turned around. He handed the glass to the nearest person. He walked in the opposite direction. And in that single, quiet movement, no announcement, no explanation, no dramatic scene, one of the most anticipated comeback tours in the history of American entertainment began to come apart. The cigarette burned itself out in the ashtray. Nobody picked it up. So what was really happening in that corridor? And why has it taken this long for anyone to tell the truth about it? To understand that corridor, you have to go back to March 21st, 1987, not to Las Vegas, not to a stage, to a mountainside in the San Bernardino Range, where a California Air National Guard F-4 Phantom jet went into a peak in conditions that the investigation would later describe as disorientation in low visibility. The pilot's name was Dean Paul Martin. He was 35 years old. He was the eldest son of Dean Martin. He had been flying since his early 20s, had served, had the kind of physical ease in a cockpit that his father had on a stage. The specific confidence of someone who had found their instrument and trusted it completely. The jet did not come down in pieces. It came down in the way aircraft come down when they do not come down intentionally. Fast, total, without the consideration that human beings bring to their exits. Dean Paul Martin was gone on impact. Dean Martin received the call at his home in Beverly Hills. He was alone when it came. The time was early afternoon. He had been doing what he did in early afternoons in that period. Not very much. The specific low-pressure idling of a man who has reached a point in a career where the demands on his time are self-generated rather than externally imposed. A drink, perhaps. The television on at low volume. The particular piece of a house that was quiet in the way houses are quiet when they have been lived in long enough to have settled into their own temperature. The call came. He sat in his house for a period of time that nobody has ever precisely accounted for. The hours between the call and the first evidence of him being present in the world again. Answering a phone, opening a door, becoming visible in the way that people become visible when they have decided they can be seen again. That period is a blank in the record. What happened in his house during those hours belongs to him and to the walls of that room, and to whatever version of silence a man inhabits when he has just been told that his son is gone. Dean Paul Martin was 35 years old when he died. He had been a presence in his father's life in the specific way that eldest children are presences. Not always visible, not always close, but foundational. The existence that predates all the other arrangements, the one that changes everything it touches simply by being there. His father had been at his first steps, at the school plays, at the moments that fathers attend not because they are required to but because the attendance is its own purpose. because being present is the whole of the job. He had been at the air shows. He had watched his son fly the way fathers watch their children do the things their children are made for. With a pride that has some fear in it, because the things we are made for are sometimes dangerous. He had not been on the mountain in San Bernardino. He had been in Beverly Hills, in the house in the early afternoon. When the call came, he sat in his house for hours. And when he emerged, the people around him described a man who had undergone a fundamental reorganization. Not visibly, not dramatically. Dean Martin did not have public breakdowns. He did not give interviews about his grief, or appear on television to discuss what he was feeling. He was, in all the external measures, the same man. He showed up. He answered calls. He was present in the rooms that required him. But the quality of the presence had changed. His longtime assistant described it as a stillness that had not been there before. Not the calm of a man at rest, the stillness of a man in whom something had stopped. He was always still, she said years later. But it used to be a choice. After Dean Paul, it was just what he was. The stillness of a man who has lost the thing he did not know was holding him in place. That was who Frank Sinatra called in the fall of 1987. Frank Sinatra had been planning what would become the Together Again tour for months. The concept was simple in the way that the best ideas are simple. Put three men on a stage who had not shared a stage in years and let the audience experience the specific electricity of reunion. Dean Martin, Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., the Rat Pack, or what remained of it, one more time. The financial projections were significant. In the language of 1988 entertainment economics, the tour was projected to generate in the range of $20 million across its run. Major markets. The kind of numbers that the industry generated for names that carried the weight of 20 years of American cultural mythology. Dean's share alone would have been substantial. He said yes. He said yes the way men say yes to things in the months after a catastrophic loss. Not from genuine desire, but from the understanding that motion is preferable to stillness. That the structure of a commitment provides a frame when the interior architecture has collapsed. He began the work of preparation. He rehearsed. He was present at the planning meetings. He did what Dean Martin had always done when he had agreed to something. He showed up. He did the job. He was reliable in the way that performers who have been working for 40 years are reliable. But the people around him noticed something. In rehearsals, he was technically present. He hit his marks. He sang the songs. He gave the rooms what the rooms required. What he did not give them was the thing underneath the technique. The thing that had always made a Dean Martin performance something more than a technically accomplished execution of a set list. The ease. It was gone. Not the performance of ease. He could still produce that. Muscle memory alone could produce that after 40 years. But the genuine article. The quality of a man who was actually in his body, pleased to be in the room. He was not pleased to be in the room. He was in the room because he had said he would be. And there is a version of a career and a version of a life in which that is enough. For Dean Martin in 1988, it was not. The tour opened in February 1988 at the Reunion Arena in Dallas. The house was full. It had been full since tickets went on sale. The kind of immediate sell-out that happens when the name recognition is absolute and the nostalgia is genuine, and the people who grew up with something are given the chance to be in the same room with it with some broom, with one more time. The audience that night was, in the main, the audience that Dean Martin had been performing for since the 1950s. They were older now. The men had the specific bearing of men who had raised their families and done their work and arrived at the age where what they wanted from an evening was not novelty but recognition. The women wore the kind of jewelry that is not acquired quickly. They had come to be in the room with something they had loved for a long time. They got what they came for. Sammy Davis Jr. was in his element. Precise, physical, incandescent in the way he had always been incandescent, the performer's performer. A man who had been on stages since childhood and who inhabited them with a naturalness that made the effort invisible. Frank Sinatra was in his element. The voice was different from what it had been in 1962 or 1968. Time does things to voices. The instrument changes, the range narrows, but the authority was intact. The specific quality of Sinatra in a room, the sense that the room was being organized around his presence, was present and felt, and the audiences responded to it the way people respond to things that are exactly what they expected and better than they feared. The Rat Pack chemistry was there. The specific alchemy of three men who had spent decades developing the shorthand of shared performance. The jokes that arrived on cue. The comic timing that required no rehearsal because it had been rehearsed by 40 years of living in each other's professional proximity. It was all there, but something was off. Not in any way that made headlines immediately. Not in any way that the audiences in the first weeks could have articulated. But the people who worked the tour, who were backstage, who moved through the daily infrastructure of a major concert production, they noticed. Dean was somewhere else. He showed up. He performed. He said the lines and sang the songs and hit the beats that 40 years of performing had made automatic. But the eyes were somewhere else. A sound engineer who worked the first leg of the tour described it in an account given to a music journalist several years later. He said that in the first few shows, he had looked at Dean Martin from the mixing board, which gave him a particular angle on the stage, and had thought, for a moment, that something was wrong with the lights, that the warmth that usually surrounded Dean Martin in performance was absent. Then he realized the lights were fine. It was not the lights. Here is the part that nobody in the press got right. The narrative that circulated in 1988, when Dean Martin left the tour in April, was the narrative of a difficult man, a man who was temperamental, who had changed, who could not be relied upon, who had walked away from a major financial commitment and left his partners in a difficult position. The word that appeared most in the coverage was quit. Dean Martin quit the tour. That was the story. But quit implies a choice made from a position of agency, a decision made by someone who has options and has evaluated them and has decided that none of them are acceptable. Quit implies that the person leaving had the full use of themselves available to them and deployed that self toward the decision to leave. Dean Martin did not have the full use of himself available to him in 1988. He had what was left after March 21st, 1987. And what was left was a man who could produce the performance, but could not produce the thing the performance was supposed to contain. He had a word for it, apparently. He used it once in a conversation with his daughter Diana that she later wrote about. He said, "I cannot find the feeling." 4 words. From a man who had spent 50 years making rooms feel things. He could not find the feeling. If you understand what it means to show up for something when the thing that made it yours is no longer available to you, tap the like button, not for the algorithm, for the idea that the true story of Dean Martin in 1988 deserves to be told correctly. Stay with me. The night at the Greek Theater was not the first night the feeling had been missing. It had been missing since February. He had known it since the first show. He had performed through it, night after night, the way a man performs through pain. Not heroically, not as a conscious act of will, but because the alternative is stopping. And stopping means acknowledging what the performance has been concealing. Sinatra had spoken to him about it, not in the confrontational way that the press later suggested. No ultimatums, no threats, nothing that belonged in the narrative of two difficult men in conflict. Frank Sinatra had known Dean Martin for 40 years. He knew the difference between a man who was being difficult and a man who was in trouble. He spoke to Dean the way men of their generation speak to each other when something is wrong. Sideways, through other subjects. In the coded language of people who have learned that direct approach is sometimes less kind than the oblique one. He said, "You do not have to do this," Dean said. "I know." "Ah," Frank said. "Then why are you here?" Dean said. "Because I told you I would be." That was the whole of it. Two men in a dressing room somewhere on the tour. The language of 40 years of friendship compressed into 8 words. Neither of them saying the actual thing, because the actual thing did not need to be said. Dean was there because he had made a commitment. He was not there because he wanted to be. And somewhere between those two facts, between the commitment and the want, was the specific geography of a man trying to carry a grief that had no place to go. The grief of a father who has outlived his son. There is no protocol for that. No industry convention. No set of professional obligations that provides a framework for continuing to perform, when what you are performing is the absence of the thing that made performing possible. Dean Martin had been performing presence for 50 years. In 1988, the presence was gone. He was performing its shadow, and at some point on a warm night in Los Angeles, standing in a concrete corridor with a glass in his hand and a cigarette burning in an ashtray, he understood that he could not do it one more night. Not that he would not, that he could not. He did not make a speech. He did not call a meeting. He did not issue a statement or summon his management or do any of the things that a man managing a public situation does when he has decided to exit it. He handed someone the glass. He walked in the other direction. The cigarette burned itself out on the edge of the ashtray. Sammy Davis Jr. was already in position for the show. Frank Sinatra was told. The production went into the particular controlled crisis mode that major concert productions have protocols for. Because things go wrong in major concert productions, and the protocols exist for exactly that reason. And Dean Martin went home, not to a hotel room, home, to Beverly Hills, to the house where he had received the call about Dean Paul. He went home. The press coverage that followed was, in the main, unkind, capricious, difficult. The language of an industry that had been inconvenienced by a man's grief and that processed the inconvenience by assigning the man a character flaw. The tour continued without him. Liza Minnelli stepped in. The production adapted the way productions adapt. The $20 million, or whatever the precise figure was not something Dean Martin ever publicly addressed. He did not explain himself to the press. He did not give the interview that would have contextualized the decision, that would have placed it in the 18 months that preceded it, that would have told the story of a father rather than the story of a difficult performer. He simply did not go back. Here is what the record shows when you look at it straight. Dean Martin performed in public for the last time in 1988. Not the tour, a smaller performance, a charity event, the kind of low-pressure appearance that a man makes when he wants to be present without being exposed to the full weight of a major production. He was 71 years old. He retired to his house in Beverly Hills. He saw his daughters. He saw the few close friends who understood. without being told, that the socializing that had always been the texture of his life was no longer something he had available to him. He played golf occasionally, for the first few years. Before that, too, became something that cost more than it returned. He watched television, a lot of television, not as entertainment exactly, more as the company of sound and movement in a house that had become very quiet. The television was on in the afternoons and into the evenings and sometimes into the night. The specific background of a man who is not watching but who needs the room to not be silent. He ate at a few restaurants, always the same ones. La Famiglia on Cannon Drive in Beverly Hills, where the owner knew his table and his order and understood, without being told, that what he needed from a restaurant was not novelty, but the comfort of the familiar. Always the same tables. Always the window or the corner, or whichever position put his back to the room and his eyes toward the street. The specific geography of a man who has reduced his world to the dimensions he can manage. His daughters visited. Dina, who was close to him in those years in the way that daughters become close to fathers, when the fathers have stopped performing and become simply themselves, came regularly. She brought her own children, his grandchildren, the continuation that families are supposed to be. He was present for those visits in a way he was not always present for other things. The children, apparently, were something he could still find. He was good with children. He had always been good with children. The ease that could abandon him in adult rooms somehow remained available when the room was small enough and the expectation was simply to be there. He was there for his grandchildren. Frank Sinatra called regularly. The calls were short. They covered nothing of consequence. In the external sense, the weather, old stories. The kind of conversation that two men who have known each other for 40 years can have without needing a subject. Frank had his own losses in those years. Sammy Davis Jr. died in May 1990. The world they had inhabited together was contracting. The roster of the people who had been present for the significant moments growing shorter. Frank called. Dean answered. Sometimes the calls were longer. Sometimes Dean would talk about Dean Paul. Not about the accident, not about the investigation or the mountain or the specific facts of what had happened. About the boy. About the things a father remembers. A game of catch in the backyard. A trip somewhere. The specific texture of a child's presence in a house. The sounds and the weight and the gravitational field that a person generates simply by existing in a space, and that you do not know is there until it is gone. Frank listened. That was the exchange of those calls in their most essential form. A man talking about his son. A friend listening. The two men who had filled the largest rooms in American entertainment. Reduced to the most private and necessary human transaction. One person speaking his grief and another person holding it. Frank Sinatra's own health declined in the 1990s. The calls continued as long as they could. Dean Martin died on December 25, 1995. He was 78 years old. It was Christmas morning. His daughter Diana later said that there was something that felt intentional about the date, though she acknowledged she could not explain why she felt that. That her father had always had a quality of choosing his own timing, his own terms, his own way of entering and exiting rooms. He had chosen his terms. He had walked out of the Greek theater with a half-smoked cigarette on the edge of an ashtray. He had not gone back. Here is what this story is actually about. Not the $20 million, which is the number the headline uses because numbers make things concrete and concrete things get clicked. Not the tour, or the Rat Pack, or the specific machinery of 1988 entertainment economics. This is a story about the limits of performance, Every person who has ever had to show up for something while carrying something unspeakable knows what Dean Martin was doing in that corridor. You have done a version of it, not on a stage, not for $20 million, but in the office, at the family dinner, in the meeting where everyone needed you to be the version of yourself that you have been reliably producing for years, and the version was not available, and you had to make a choice. You performed it, or you put down the glass. Dean Martin put down the glass, not because he did not care about his commitments. The evidence suggests he cared deeply about them. He had shown up for months, had carried the grief through show after show, had given the audiences the technical version of the thing they had paid for even when the authentic version was not accessible. He put down the glass because the authentic version had been gone for a year, and the gap between what he was producing and what he knew himself capable of had become a distance he could no longer pretend was not there. That is not weakness. That is a man who knows the difference between a performance and the real thing, and who, at 71 years old, with the money and the career and the decades behind him, had finally arrived at the age where the difference mattered more than the money. The media called it quitting. His daughter called it honesty. She said that her father, for most of his life, had given people what they needed from him, had filled the rooms, had been Dean Martin, reliable, warm, easy, present. After Dean Paul, she said he could only be her father, and her father was a man in grief. That man could not perform. Here is the thing about performing grief. It is possible to do it for a long time, longer than most people would expect. The human capacity for continuing to function in the absence of the thing that made functioning feel meaningful is, it turns out, quite large. Dean Martin demonstrated that capacity for 18 months. He showed up for the tour meetings. He rehearsed. He performed the first shows. He gave the audiences the version of Dean Martin they had paid to see. Technically accomplished. Emotionally present in the ways that muscle memory makes possible. Genuinely warm in the moments when the warmth was accessible. He performed his way through 18 months of grief, and then, in a concrete corridor on a warm night in Los Angeles, the performance reached its limit, not the outer limit of what was possible. He might have been able to continue physically. The body can be compelled to do a great many things that the interior life is no longer available for. He reached the limit of what he was willing to do. That is a different kind of limit. It is the limit that a man arrives at when he has decided. Not dramatically, not with an announcement, but quietly, in the specific privacy of a corridor, with a cigarette burning on an ashtray. That what he owes the world and what he owes himself are not the same number. He owed the world, perhaps, the continuation of the tour, the professionalism, the reliability, the $20 million of expectation that had been built around his name and his presence and his willingness to show up. He owed himself something else. He owed himself the honesty of putting down the glass. Think about the last time you were asked to perform something that was no longer inside you. Not a song, not a show, but the version of yourself that a room required. The reliable one, the easy one. The one that has been showing up so consistently that people have stopped asking whether it costs you anything. Did you perform it? Or did you put down the glass? There is no right answer. The world requires a great deal of performing. Most of the time, the performing is the right choice. It is how we keep our commitments, how we show up for the people who depend on our showing up, how we participate in the life around us, even when participation is expensive. But sometimes the truest thing a man can do is turn around in a corridor, not with a speech, not with an explanation, with the quiet, private, final dignity of a man who knows what he has and does not have, and who has decided that tonight he does not have it. Dean Martin turned around. He left the cigarette burning. He went home. And in the morning, his daughters knew where he was. The histories of the Rat Pack have been written many times. The books and the documentaries and the biographical accounts return again and again to the glamour of the 1960s, to the Copa room and the summit and the specific electricity of those men in those rooms in that era. They return to the performance. They do not often return to the corridor, to the man standing in a concrete space with a glass in his hand and a cigarette on an ashtray, making the quietest and the truest decision of a 50-year career. But the corridor is the real story. The corridor is where Dean Martin, stripped of the stage and the lights and the architecture of a performance, was simply a father. A father who had outlived his son. A father who had been trying for 18 months to find the feeling that had powered everything he had ever done on a stage. A father who, on a warm night in Los Angeles in 1988, finally understood that he had looked long enough. The feeling was not coming back, not because it was gone from him entirely, but because the shape of everything had changed, and the version of Dean Martin that had inhabited those stages and filled those rooms was a version that had been built, at least in part, by the specific gravitational field of his son's existence. Dean Paul was gone, and the version of Dean Martin who could be easy and warm and present in the way those rooms required had gone with him. What was left was a father, and the father was done performing. There are more stories like this one. Stories about the people behind the performances, about what it cost them, about the gap between what the world saw on the stage and what existed in the corridor outside it. If this story reached you, if the corridor feels more real to you than the Copa room, subscribe. Not because the algorithm needs it, though it does. Because the next story is about a different kind of quiet, a different kind of cost. A different man who turned around when the room needed him to keep going. And it is the story that explains something about all of them. Dean Martin's house in Beverly Hills is still there. Different owners now, different rooms, probably, in the way that houses change when the people who defined them are gone. Repainted, refurnished. The specific accumulation of a particular life replaced by the specific accumulation of a different one. But the address is the same. And on Christmas morning, the light in that part of Beverly Hills arrives at a particular angle, low and gold. The way winter light in California arrives, not cold, not harsh, but with a quality of distance that is not unfriendly. The afternoon sun comes through whatever windows are on the west side of that house and lies across whatever floor is there now for about 20 minutes. Then it moves on. The cigarette is long gone, but the corridor is still there in the record of that summer, in the accounts of the people who were standing in it when the decision was made. A man set down a glass. He turned around. He went home. That was Dean Martin. That was the whole of the $20 million. And now you know what it was really about.